Thanks for being prompt. My name's Alistair. To those that have just heard that, apologies for the duplication. This evening is a lot of stuff to get through, so it's going to be a fairly fast-paced event, all around, unsurprisingly, given the invites and slide that's on screen right now, all around the subject of how to put together an effective CV and, to a degree, a LinkedIn profile, with the ultimate aim of getting more interviews. Now, you've been invited via the auspices of WebRecruit, and we're nothing to do with WebRecruit, more on that later. We're a partner of theirs, but that's as far as it goes. We are a separate company. But because they've invited you along under the banner of their HR sector spotlight, one thing I wanted to establish at this early stage was whether there are many HR people actually on this evening. So I've got a little poll that I'd like to issue out and for you to take part in. So you should see a question: are you currently in an HR or HR-related role? And I'd like you just to click the appropriate answer, and then we will act accordingly. I did look at the registration form before joining, and there weren't many HR people who actually seemed to have registered, bizarrely. So, and the poll seems to reflect that. We have got, not that this is the huge, most interesting statistic you're going to have here, certainly not tonight. It looks like get resolved. Please use that to facilitate. Okay, I mentioned that you've been invited via WebRecruit and that we're a separate business. Just wanted to briefly explain who on earth we are. Again, unsurprisingly, given the slides, the business that I work for is called the CV and Interview Advisors. We exist to provide people with CV writing and career enhancement advice. So that covers LinkedIn profiles, interview coaching, interview guidance, etc. Now, part of the reason I mention that, of course, is unashamedly a plug for our services, but also, and probably more importantly, in fairness, is I wanted to reinforce the fact that we know what we're doing to some degree. Now, ultimately, you will be the judge of that to some degree, I guess, later this evening. But it's important that for you to know that we've been doing this for a number of years. My own background, again, not to big myself up, but to explain that I've seen how CVs are used from most angles. So I've employed people in the traditional sense. I have been in recruitment, both in permanent and contract. I've reviewed, I guess, north of 10,000 CVs now for this company and written a fair few earlier in my career with them as well. So the key thing here is that what you're about to learn this evening is not something that I thought, or indeed any of my colleagues thought, was a great idea worth talking about with no substance. It actually is stuff we put into practice every day of the week for people who need help. We'll explore that later in terms of what help and how effective it can be, but that's our stock in trade. That's why we exist. Now, there are going to be a few bits of jargon floating around, not much, but a few bits, stuff that may not be terminology that you see and use every day. Hot skills is one of those bits of jargon. It's not hugely complex, in fairness, but we know what the hot skills are in most marketplace. We know what people are actually looking for. Most individuals, not all, but most individuals tend to get this hideously wrong. They write a CV focusing on completely the wrong skills. Now, you might think that's rather odd, and you may challenge that assumption. I will prove that later to some degree. As I say, it's not everybody, but a fair few people completely miss what's being sought by the marketplace. Bottom line is, we know what to do to get more interviews, and I hopefully will be able to prove that case during the course of this evening. So, to reinforce the fact that what you're about to learn actually does work if implemented properly, I wanted to show you a quote from an email that we got earlier this year from somebody who actually attended one of these WebRecruit webinars. Now, they were an extreme case in the sense that they had been really struggling to get interest in themselves as an individual. They've been applying for lots and lots of jobs, getting nothing in return, absolutely nothing. No explanations, no reasoning, no rationale, just zilch. Extreme in the sense that they've been battling away for 3 years in a tough job market in the UK, trying to get interest in their services. Nobody had bothered to sit them down during that 3 years and say, I'm afraid, Joe Bloggs, your CV is horrendous, which it was, in fairness. It was a horrendous CV. As an individual, quite a credible individual, had valid skills, good experience, they're quite a nice person in the great scheme of things, but had a hideous CV. The message was not being communicated at all well, yet nobody had told them in 3 years that that's why they were continually being rejected for opportunities they'd been applying for. We were the bearer of that bad news, I'm afraid, partly via the webinar, partly by taking a look at their CV. We were able to help, guide them constructively, point them in the right direction, and put some effort into sorting that problem. And literally overnight, they went out, new CV, started getting interest and attention, subsequently secured a new job after 3 years of trying. Individual didn't change, they didn't buy a new suit, they didn't get an interview-winning haircut, they just changed the message they were sending to their audience, and that's what tonight is all about. Some people, be you a cynic or not, doesn't really matter, but some people will logically say, okay, well, if I'm about to consider improving my CV myself or engaging the services of a third party to fix it, what kind of improvement ought I get in terms of interview success? Well, it's very hard to measure, truth be told, because ultimately the only way you could assess it is you apply for the same job with 2 different CVs, a before and an after, which is patently not something you really ought to be doing. But if you look at people who've struggled and then people who suddenly start getting interviews and you equate that down to a CV having been changed, we know on average people ought to get a 30 to 50% uplift in the number of interviews they're securing if they go to market with a more effective CV. For some people, it's stratospherically higher than that. For some people, it's a bit lower. But the heartland is a strong double-digit increase in percentage terms of the number of interviews being secured, simply by changing the message you send to your audience, nothing else. To reinforce this point about CVs, because a lot of people arrive at these webinars, I have to say, probably thinking, A, they've got a good CV, or a strong CV, or even having been told that by recruiters and hiring managers or HR people. And sometimes that's just plain wrong, and sometimes they're not given the real truth about their CV. But we know, time and time again, that the problem recruiters face, and by this I mean recruiting consultants typically, the comment that's on screen now typically comes across time and time again, and that is akin to the fact that it's impossible to tell who is good and who isn't from their CV, which is a real indictment on the marketplace. Now, to back this up, there are all sorts of stats floating around this kind of thing, but to give you some kind of indication, if you ask a bunch of individuals whether they think they've got a good or a strong CV, something like 90% plus of candidates would say they fall into that category. That's very commonly the case. It doesn't matter when you ask it, who you ask, 9 out of 10 people tend to believe they've got a strong or a good CV. If you then go and ask recruiters, from all the applicants they have for all of their jobs, how many people have a strong, effective CV that passes muster to get an interview, it's less than 20%. So who's right? You've got a bunch of candidates thinking they've got a great CV, you've got a bunch of recruiters thinking that most CVs are far from great. So there is a problem, there is a disconnect. To try and assess whether your own CV is up to spec or not, I'm going to quickly give you some pointers before we focus on what you should be doing, but just some pointers to maybe guide you in the direction of whether you might have a problem or not. As I said, a lot of people strongly believe their CV is the least of their problems, whereas in most cases the CV is the root cause of a lot of their problems. So if you've got a CV that is in effect just a list of stuff, and you might say, well, what is a CV if it isn't a list of stuff? But my point here is that if you're just presenting to an audience the jobs you've done, where you live, the education that you've had, and the qualifications you've gained, the professional development that you might have secured, your hobbies and interests, and the dates surrounding your jobs, that is just factual information. It's not really helping a great deal. There are lots of people out there who can present very similar looking factual information about their career. And lo and behold, as a recruiter, what you tend to find is lots of people who would appear to be very similar to each other applying for jobs. Now, you have to differentiate yourself. So going to market with just a list of stuff is not a clever idea. And if you're still unconvinced, just imagine anything that you've bought recently. A TV, washing machine, dishwasher, car, boat, if you're lucky enough, house. You won't have bought any of those things purely as a consequence of having reviewed a boring list of statistics, unless you're very strange. So take the car as an example. Second-hand or new, it doesn't matter. You walk into the showroom, salesperson approaches you. It's clear that you're interested in the car, and they say quite clearly that they've got a brilliant car for you. It's red, 2 meters wide, 5 meters long, 1.5 meters tall. Now, you're not really going to fall in love with that car, or let's say, unless you're a strange individual. It's highly unlikely you'd even jump into it and take it for a test drive based on those statistics. But that's how most people go to market with their CV, akin to just communicating some basic facts about their abilities or perceived abilities. So that's one warning sign. So if you're conscious that that's all you're presenting to your audience, I would suggest that that's beginning to say you might have a bit of a problem. Your CV will not be as effective as it could be. Second issue. No matter when you left school, college, or university, you set up your CV, and all you've done over time is really add to it as you gained new jobs, new qualifications. That is also a warning sign. Things have moved on. The style and shape of a good, effective CV is different from what it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. If you don't know what the hot skills are being sought by your marketplace, and as I say, a lot of people get this wrong for reasons that I'll clarify very shortly, but if you're not clear on what the market is actually looking for their ideal candidate, then it's highly unlikely you can position your CV accordingly, which means it's going to be less effective than it should be. And a lot of people will be aware that they need to maybe customize and bespoke their CV to their audience, but a lot of people don't understand who their audience is or indeed what their audience is. So to illustrate that point, a lot of large-scale employers these days, public and private sector, a lot of big recruiters will use machines to process the initial applications for a job. Now, sometimes the number of applicants is very high. Some of you will be familiar with this, some of you may not. But often jobs in the UK, for example, will attract hundreds, if not thousands, of applicants, even for fairly specialist roles. We had a chap from Michael Page Finance doing one of these webinars with us earlier in the year, and they had posted a job for a fairly specialist finance director role in the UK, and it attracted 1,500 applicants. Now, they only wanted one candidate, a successful candidate to be placed. They probably would have been prepared for the client to interview 3 to 5 people tops. Can you imagine the process that has to go from 1,500 down to 5? It's brutal. Now, I don't know, in fairness with Michael Page, we didn't explore that, but for a lot of recruiters or employers, that filtering process to get from a big number down to a more modest, controllable number is brutal, is done by machine, not human being. It's scanning technology, it's looking for keywords and phrases. So there's a lot of very good, strong candidates out there who continually get rejected because their CV doesn't have the content that the programmer has programmed the computer to look out for. And you could argue all day whether the input into the computer, the program, the logic is right and proper. It may well not be, but if that's what it is, that's what it is, and you have to deal with that. So your target audience is not just people, it's a machine in some cases, and if it's not a machine, it is a person, and a person who's got to go from 1,500 down to 5 is not going to give your CV very much time and attention. They are going to be quickly looking for clues. Am I looking at somebody that's valid, with appropriate skills, in the right kind of place? Is the picture that's been painted on this CV anywhere close to the one I have in my mind as to who the ideal kind of candidate is? If you get that right, you probably progress. If you don't, you get rejected. And in less time than it's taken me to explain that, far less time, that decision will have been made for an individual, possibly even 3 or 4 individuals. It's that brutal. So, the most important message that you should take away from this evening, and what we're going to spend the balance of the session talking about and how to do it, is how on earth you should present yourself well on paper. And we believe very strongly that you should do this via what we call a strong business case as to why people should be interviewing you. Now, it's a justification, if you like. It's the reason why an individual who probably doesn't know you from Adam should be compelled to pick up the phone, send you an email, do whatever they need to do to engage you further in the application process. That's really important. That's how you approach your CV. It needs to become a strong business case as to why somebody should interview you. So unsurprisingly, bad CV is just a list of stuff. Good CV, strong business case. Now, if you go back to that imaginary purchase that you've made recently, car, boat, house, whatever, most decisions you will have made of that ilk are a consequence of you having formed in your mind for yourself, or somebody having formed in your mind on your behalf, a strong business case justification as to why you should have taken that decision that you did. And that's why doing this on your CV works very well. Finally, in terms of the stats you should keep an eye on, indicators you should look out for regarding your current CV as it stands, there's a dead easy ratio to keep an eye on. It tells you pretty much everything you need to know about the state of your CV. If you apply for 10 opportunities that you know hand on heart you could perform, so there is a caveat. You can't wake up in the morning thinking that you'd rather like to be a nuclear submarine pilot or captain or whatever they're called, and somebody could write a CV to achieve that. Obviously, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, a bit ridiculous, but some people almost make that kind of leap or try to. So assuming that you're applying for relevant roles that you know you could technically perform, if you apply for 10 of them, you get 10 interviews, happy days. You can't improve upon that. Your CV is doing its job. It's sending the right message to your audience. It's building a business case. Conversely, if you're only getting 1, 2, 3 interviews out of the 10 applications, or none at all, it would suggest that something's going wrong, of course. Now, most people take it personally. They think, there's a problem here. It must be to do with me and my skill set, and they refuse sometimes to believe that the root cause of the problem is actually the CV. Partly because very few recruiters, even fewer employers, will sit that individual down or have a conversation with them or send them an email saying, really sorry, the reason we didn't put you forward is because your CV didn't tell us the message we'd like to have seen. But that is the harsh reality in most cases. And I can virtually guarantee, without even looking at your CV, if you're struggling to get interviews for jobs you know you could perform and you're scratching your head wondering why you're not getting those interviews, it is largely because the message you're sending is not resonating with your audience for whatever reason. Now, I can't tell you the reason because I can't see it, of course, but I can virtually guarantee it's the message you're sending is the problem, nothing to do with you. Most recruiters and employers don't know you from Adam, so it's not a personal decision. It's a decision based purely on the message, your advertisement, if you like, your sales and marketing collateral, your CV, has not done its job. Good news is that can be fixed. And so tonight will help, because if you want to fix it yourself, you'll learn a lot to do that. But if you need help, and help being engaged in our services, of course, it will also help. Okay, so let's go on to the future in terms of what you should be doing, having given you a sound basis hopefully to establish whether you think you might need help in the first place. But as I say, that statistic, interview to application ratio, is absolutely key. It tells you everything you need to know. I should just mention actually, what you'll often hear from recruiters, and they get a hard press sometimes, which is sometimes unfair. Their job is not to provide CV advice, in fairness. Their job often is to provide the candidates that will ultimately get placed by their clients and earn the recruiting company a fee and solve a problem for their client. Brutally, that is what they're there for. They're not there to give people CV advice. It's not sometimes the thing that they're best qualified to do anyway. They should be good at recognizing talent when they see it, but that's different from giving CV advice. An employer is even less likely to give an opinion to anybody else other than themselves and possibly the recruiter for some obvious reasons around discrimination and all sorts of other legal loopholes and technicalities. But I guarantee the kind of conversations that sometimes go on between employer and recruiter are fairly fruity, and sometimes as blunt as, I wouldn't interview Joe Bloggs in a million years because their CV is a pile of insert expletive. I want to say something else then. But that is what often happens. Now, it'll never get made publicly known to people, but that kind of conversation does occur. So to fix those kind of issues, we need to start somewhere. What's on screen now is a structure of the CV that explains to some degree where you should be with the flow of the document. This isn't the answer to everybody's problems, but it's a start point. There are three key areas on this structure that really do make a difference, and that I'm going to focus most of the remaining session on. And if you get these three sections right, it's critical to building a strong business case as to why somebody should be interested in interviewing you. The rest of the document is important, but not as critical as those three highlighted areas. So I'm going to go through each of these in turn, each of the red highlighted areas, to explain how this business case is built. I'll then touch on the rest of the CV and some bits and pieces that are important, and then we'll move on to LinkedIn. During which time I will show you a real-life example of the CV and how it should be put together to make this strong business case. Okay, so first of all, the opening summary. Now, a lot of people will have this on their CV. You might call it a professional profile, a personal profile, a summary, a God knows what. Some people call it career objective, and then it's everything but a career objective. To a degree, it doesn't really matter what you call this opening section if you have one, and we do believe it is a good idea to have something to open up and introduce you as an individual. What most people tend to do here, though, is not very differentiating, not very compelling, and actually focus on all the things that the recruiter and hiring manager are least interested in. More on that very soon. So let's first explain what should be happening. And the very first thing that should be happening is not what you see on the screen now. But if this is familiar to you in any way, shape or form, then it's a warning sign again that all is not well with your CV. I won't read this out verbatim, you can look at it yourself, but just remember some of this text. If there's any of this that makes you think, this is a bit close to call, this is a bit like my CV as it currently stands, if you've got words and sentiment a bit like what's on screen now, then I would suggest you're in a bad place. Take a look at what we believe we should be doing, and then we can revisit that. So if you're going to apply for a job, doesn't matter what kind of job it is, but let's, for argument's sake, because we've got this focus on HR within WebRecruit, let's say it's an HR manager. It could be anything. Even if you don't carry the title of HR manager right now, but that's your stock in trade, that's generically how you'd refer to what your capabilities are, or HR director, or HR executive, or HR officer, or project manager or accountant or finance director, whatever it may be, it would make sense, would it not, to suggest on your CV that you're pretty much what the audience is actually looking for. And most people don't do that. Most people leave that until their career history and in their current role describe what their job title is. And they assume that the reader will, of course, read through the document, get to that point, and understand what that all means. And hopefully what I've demonstrated already is sometimes the process is so brutal and brief that there are some people whose CV will never be read that far, for whatever reason. And you can't legislate for that. There's nothing you can do about that, except try and get across the key message about what you've got to offer as quickly as possible to whoever picks up your CV, machine or human. So we recommend the very first thing you do on the CV, other than put your name, is describe what you are in some kind of sentiment that reflects back to your audience what they're expecting to see for their ideal candidate. So if they're recruiting for an HR manager and you are capable of performing the HR management role, or very similar to, state that, so that the reader's thinking, hallelujah, here's somebody who's relevant to the sector that I'm operating in, to the job that I'm looking for. This would appear to be somebody close to what I'm looking for. Secondly, again, a bit of jargon, I'm afraid, what is your core value proposition? Well, you might say, what on earth is a core value proposition? Well, it's the return on somebody's investment that you have to offer. It's the reason you exist on this planet right now. It's the key thing that you've got to offer in your job function, expressed in some way that the audience will find compelling. Now, I'll show you an example very shortly, but it's really important because if somebody's going to invest 15, 25, 35, 55, 95,000 pounds, euros, dollars in you every year, for pretty much all roles these days, somebody's expecting a return on that investment. You have to articulate that to some degree. Linked to that, most people tend to be pretty good at a handful of things, 2, 3, 4 things that they're really good at, that they could deliver day in, day out if asked to do so. Good idea to talk about those in this opening statement, and then finally to align it with the skills that are actually being sought by the marketplace that you're in. Now, I'll show you an example of a fairly powerful opening summary statement. You can read it for yourselves, but it addresses all of the 4 points that I've just talked about. And I would also stress at this point that it doesn't matter what level you're at, it doesn't matter how much experience you have or have not got, even if you just graduated and you had done no full-time permanent work as at this moment in time, even those kind of people could still write something that adheres to the 4 bullet points that I've just mentioned. You need to switch and play around with the content a bit, of course, and the message, and think about what your audience is actually imagining and looking for. But everybody anywhere can write something that works and adheres to these 4 points. So it's got nothing to do with the level you're at. It's got nothing to do with the amount of experience you've got. It's all about suggesting to your audience that you're pretty much what they're looking for. So in this particular case, the what are you is that they're a senior HR compensation benefits and rewards specialist, so firmly in the HR space. It heightens that a little bit in terms of the sector that they've got experience within, which is fast-moving consumer goods. Their value proposition is all about being able to deliver that, in effect. The things that they're good at, as prefaced by key strengths, include, which also reinforces their value proposition to some degree, and it's aligned with skills being sought by the marketplace, we would imagine. We don't know the individual, or whether this is a real example. We don't know the jobs they're applying for, but it would seem to be appropriate. Now compare it to that text that I showed you earlier, and think about anything that you might have on your CV. What this doesn't reference are any behavioural nonsenses like enthusiasm, dedication, commitment, passion, attention to detail, ability to work in a team or as an individual. And remember I said earlier, most people get their skills wrong, sometimes dramatically. That's what I mean. Most people focus on behavioural skills on their CV, things that can't actually be proven on the CV, and worse still, things that aren't being sought by the recruiter or employer at this stage of the application process. Now, a lot of people I can imagine shouting at the screen right now thinking, hang on a minute, you talked about hot skills. I've seen a job advertisement. I've applied for jobs where the skills are clearly being set out as enthusiasm, dedication, entrepreneurialism, attention to detail, blah, 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 blah. And you would be right, of course. Those skills are being sought by the audience at some point in time. But that's the clue, at some point in time, not from the CV. Most decent recruiters and employers, certainly employers, will have some kind of matrix, be it in their head or on a piece of paper, a framework that suggests these are the skills that we deemed to be essential and desirable. Split within those categories are skills being sought and proven by the CV, things that can be judged before you meet somebody, and skills being sought and identified after you've met somebody. All the behavioural stuff tends to be judged far later on in the process. So it doesn't matter how enthusiastic you think you are, the attention to detail that you think you can apply, the ability to work in a team or as an individual, your dedication, your commitment, your passion, doesn't matter how good any of those things might be, no right-minded or recruiter or employer is going to judge them purely because, of you purely because you've mentioned them on your CV. They're going to be judged far later on in the process when physically you're met or you are engaged in some kind of assessment, online or face-to-face. So talking about those things on your CV is almost utterly useless. It just makes you look like everybody else. That doesn't mean to say that they're doing the right thing. They're wrong, in fact. It doesn't differentiate you. You can't prove that you're more or less enthusiastic than anybody else. If you can, you deserve a medal, because I've never seen anybody do it. So why talk about things that can't be proven on the CV that people actually aren't that interested in? That's when most people go wrong. So that's a strong opening summary or statement. The next area, so remember we're talking about 3 key areas on the CV that form this business case. We've talked about one, opening summary. Second one is an area we call key skills or areas of expertise. When I've gone through this section, I'll show you a CV in all its glory, so to speak. And before I go through this second section, I just want to sort of reinforce a point that's at the bottom of this slide, and that is that the vast majority, whatever the percentage is, it doesn't really matter, but the vast majority of recruiters and hiring managers can only make the decision on who to interview based on the contents of the CV that you send them. And in fairness, a lot of people think, well, okay, big deal, how important is that, how relevant is that? Well, it's absolutely critical because it tells you everything you need to know about the CV. There is no other means of people making a decision unless they already know you. And if they already know you and you're not getting an interview, that's a much bigger problem. So most people aren't known by recruiters and employers enough to make a decision. You're relying on them to look at the CV, to make a decision, and then to progress your application or not. So if you send a pile of rubbish on your CV, you won't get many interviews. If you send a really compelling story on your CV, a factual account of what you're able to deliver, you'll tend to get more interviews. There is no magic fairy dust that can be sprinkled on the document to reveal hidden truths. If you don't make it clear to your audience that you are a valid applicant, that you have appropriate skills, and you can back them up with evidence to prove, it won't work as effectively as you'd like it to. And if you ask most recruiters and hiring managers why they're rejecting people, it's because they would not appear to be a valid applicant for whatever reason, that they might not appear to have the appropriate skills for whatever reason, and that there doesn't seem to be much evidence to back it up anyway for whatever reason. In other words, it's very difficult for the recruiter and employer to interview you because you've not given them the information they're desperately looking for. And think about it, the recruiter's trying to sell you to their client, and the client's possibly, or the hiring manager is trying to sell you to some recruitment panel or their boss. Make their job easier, make it easy for you to be sold to whoever needs to be sold to justify the decisions that are being made. For most people, the reverse is true. It's dead easy to reject people and to justify that decision for simple things. That if you make a spelling mistake, nobody's going to give the recruiter a hard time for rejecting you because of a spelling mistake. but on more substantial issues like lack of evidence, not the appropriate skills, not appearing to be a valid candidate, normally it's dead easy to pull people up, reject them, and then to justify that decision. And that ought not to be the case for strong candidates who could technically do the work. So this second area of the CV is quite important because it allows you to present to your audience technical and functional skills that you possess that they're actually looking for. Now I stress again, this is not the place. There is no place for things like enthusiasm, dedication, commitment, passion, drive, entrepreneurialism. They are behavioral skills to some degree, softer skills that can't be proven. So there's no point in putting them on the CV. What you need to do is reflect the skills that are being sought by the audience, which is why knowledge of what hot skills are being requested by the audience is so key. So you've got an aesthetic benefit. If you get these right, visually your CV looks stronger because you're reflecting back to the audience the very things that they're actually looking for, that actually decide whether you get an interview or not. The second benefit is if you populate this section well, it will help as soon as your CV hits a database. So recruiters will be looking for keywords and phrases. They'll be searching for keywords and phrases. Employers will be doing the same thing as well to some degree. Populate this section on your CV effectively. You will appear higher up or more often or both every time anybody does a search. To illustrate the point, very rarely will you find, if ever, a recruiter sat down at their database searching for enthusiasm or dedication or attention to detail. They just don't do it. What they will be searching for are technical and functional skills like Sage Line 50 or SAP or project management, factual things that can be proven, technical skills that they're desperately seeking proof of. So all we recommend people do is in this section of the CV list things that they have a capability of performing. These are just examples. For everybody in every role, they're different. For every audience, there's a different set of ideal skills being sought. You'll not always get them 100% aligned to what your audience is looking for because some of them are mysterious and secret, I'm sure. But you'll get pretty close if you just give it a bit of thought. They're 2-word, 3-word, 4-word top kind of statements that are technical and functional skills. Now, the key thing here is there ought to be nothing that couldn't be proven on the CV if you chose to do so. So I go back to the point. Enthusiasm, you can't prove. Business partnering, you can. You could give a case study. We'll talk about that shortly. You could give some evidence to prove that. 2P transfer, you could prove that. Project and team management, you can prove that. You can talk about that. Dedication, you can't. Attention to detail is normally counter-proven by the fact that most people that put attention to detail on their CV then tend to make some glaring error, which, sad but true, just one of those quirks. So that's a key test. If you can't prove it, don't put it on the CV. Okay, I promised to show you an example. Just whilst I'm doing that and loading it up on screen, a reminder, if you want to ask any questions, by all means rattle them into the toolbar facility you've got. I see a few have been asked, as I say, that invitation is open to all. Now on screen you'll see a CV of a chap called Matt Craven. Matt Craven runs this business. He's my boss, so it's a real-life CV. Again, I can't cover everybody's interests because we've got everything from sales to IT to HR to engineering to oil and gas on this evening by the looks of it. So I have to sort of plough a fairly even furrow. In showing Matt's CV, it just gives you an example of the content that I've been talking about. So a strong opening summary. It's describing what Matt is, what value he can bring to people who are interested in his services, describing what he's good at and aligning it to skills being sought by his particular marketplace. The bullet-pointed key skills or areas of expertise, as he's described them, are technical and functional skills that he can provide and prove on the CV if required to do so. He would vary both elements here, depending on jobs he might be applying for. But another interesting pointer, despite the fact that I've worked with Matt for a number of years, and I'm his right-hand man, so to speak, there is very little I could copy and paste off this CV and stick under my own name. which is another interesting test to perform with your CV. If you can take particularly the opening summary and whatever you've got at the moment, if somebody else in your peer group, worse still anybody related to you, worse still a neighbour or random person off the street, not that you should approach them with this necessarily, but if they could use pretty much the same, if not all the text on your CV's opening statement, and actually say, yeah, okay, I might not choose to use these words precisely, but what you've described is me to a T, or I could justify if I had to, that is a really bad sign. But it happens so many times. And if you've had to look at 1,500 applicants, or even half of that, or even 25% of that, and all you're seeing is these same old statements. Oh, I'm so wonderful, I'm so enthusiastic, I'm committed, I'm bubbly, I'm driven, I'm dynamic, I pay attention to detail, and boy, can I work in a team as well as an individual. If you've seen that 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 times, you get fed up of it. It's dead easy to reject people purely because it looks like they're just another person with the same old stuff. And people will be rejected because of that. Unfair, but it happens. Technically, it's quite possible that very strong candidates will continually get rejected because their presentation is awful. And the people that get the interviews often are not necessarily the best candidates, strangely, but the ones that present the best argument. They may get flushed out of the system later, but for everybody else, too late. It's whoever gets to that first stage where somebody will pay a little bit more attention to the CV and look at really what's been going on and then interview people. Those people tend to be the ones that put together a stronger argument in the first place. Doesn't make them the best candidate for the role, sadly. Okay, we'll come back to Matt's CV very shortly. Let's take a look at the third of the three areas. So we've dealt with two: opening summary, key skills, areas of expertise. The third area, which helps form this business case that I've been rabbiting on about, is the proof, or as we call it, the career highlights. And it's the evidence to support skills that you have, critically. And it's really important that you have this, and it's really important this appears before you start telling people where you're currently working or have most recently worked, for reasons I'll touch on later. So if you're going to provide evidence of anything, you need some kind of structure to adhere to, ideally, rather than just writing random thoughts. The writing ability here is really important. It's quite a skill to condense what might be a complex project or event in your life into a meaningful, manageable amount of text. So if you're not good at that sort of thing, or you're not really sure how best to articulate things that you've done, it's a pointer that maybe you need help. Some people tend to be very good at this, some people tend to be awful at it. You'll know, I guess, whether and which camp you fall into. We use a methodology when we're writing up these career highlights called STAR, Situation, Task, Action, Results. It's used in lots of walks of life. It's not unique to us, but it is a nice tool to use to construct meaningful, concise text that explains something to a layman or third party that you've been involved with that helps prove your ability to deliver in certain areas. Here's an example. So in this statement, which is just one career highlight that we'd recommend you have on the CV, we tend to recommend for most people, the exception here being out-and-out professional contractors, but assuming that you've either been in contracting very recently, or you're a permie, or you're an interim manager, we'd recommend 3 of these highlights on the CV would be sufficient to get the message across. This is just one example. The situation here is the opening sentence that XYZ, obviously I've removed the name for obvious reasons, but XYZ PLC basically needed to integrate a number of employees from a business that they bought through acquisition. That's the situation, the scene setter, the background news, the headline, if you like. The task is the responsibility resting on this individual's shoulders at that moment in time. So you can see whoever this person was, and it is a real-life person, they were selected as HR project manager to basically run that transition program, to take those number of employees from an acquired business and integrate them into XYZ. The actions are the series of things that this person did whilst they were HR project manager to effect change, to progress from A to some other point in the alphabet. And there are a list of things you can see. Ideally, they're in sequential order, some logical order. And then the final sentence is the result, the outcome, the conclusion. What happened as a consequence of this person's involvement in this particular situation, performing this particular task. And it's quite powerful. It basically said the integration of all those employees from all those businesses was achieved within a relatively short space of time, meeting 2P compliance. So if this person is claimed to have had certain skills earlier on in the CV, this is a good piece of evidence to back it up. It would suggest this person is capable of doing the very same things that they've claimed to be capable of doing, and if they've done this properly, proof that they could do this for their future employer. Replicated a couple of times, so you've got 3 in total, is a really nice way of demonstrating to an audience proof of your ability to deliver. That's the key thing. Now, it's really important that if you're going to pick examples like this, they need to be relevant, targeted, and as quantifiable, as impactful, if you like, as possible. People who tend to do this on their CVs themselves tend to miss some of these by a country mile. So the relevance often is not right. So they think, what is the thing that I enjoyed the most, and write about that. That doesn't necessarily equal what is the best thing to show your target audience. Targeted in the sense that there's no point in going on about stuff that your future employer isn't remotely interested in, so it demands that you know that, I guess. And quantifiable in the sense that a lot of people say, oh, I was involved in this really massive project, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah, and they never really explain whether it was delivered or not, and if it was, in what time scale, did it save money, did it cost money, did it enhance processes, did it deliver anything meaningful at all? Mostly because people are way too close to what they do. They think or assume that the audience, the recruiter, the hiring manager, will automatically know what on earth they're going on about, that they will understand what they've been doing, and it is so far from the truth sometimes. So this STAR methodology is a nice way of saying, okay, we need a beginning, a middle, and an end, like a story, I guess, but it helps deal with each of the stages so that anybody could pick this up and think, okay, well, I don't know the details, I can't pretend to know the details, but there's enough here for me to think this person's obviously capable of doing something that my client or my boss is going to be interested in. Okay, let's take a look at Matt's CV again very briefly before we talk about the remaining sections of the CV and then deal with LinkedIn and wrap up. So what's on screen now is the 3 important sections that build this business case. We've talked about the first 2 sections. The third section is there, just at the base of the screen. 3 strong career highlights, in Matt's case, that demonstrate his ability to do things that he's claimed to be good at earlier on the CV. All sorts of ways of playing this. I stress again, it doesn't matter what job you're doing. If you think your job is, and this is not my words, a lot of people criticize me and say, yeah, but this doesn't apply to me. I'm just doing the payroll, for example. I can't talk about career highlights because I just run the payroll. Nonsense. Anybody, anywhere, at any level, again, whether you're a graduate just or just left school or you've got 35 years experience doing whatever you've been doing, anybody can write stuff that adheres to these criteria. What you write about varies enormously, of course. Now, for graduates, for example, you don't talk about career highlights because you don't have a career. You talk about competencies that you could deliver. So even if you've done stereotypically a spell in a fast food restaurant, you will have dealt with difficult people. You will have handled money. You will have had to have performed some kind of customer service duty, whether you liked it or not. You might even have to have done some pretty awful things surrounding the janitorial facilities. All of those things can be equated to competencies of some sort or other, and if they're relevant to your audience, you talk about them. If, and I'm not suggesting payroll is necessarily the most menial job, but we do get people saying, look, I just run the payroll, I do it 9 to 5, I don't have career highlights. Again, as I said earlier, nonsense. If you're applying for jobs that have got anything to do with payroll running, and you're doing that, and you've been doing that for the last 10 years, guess what? The audience want to know that you're good at running a payroll. They want to know that you can spot anomalies. They want to know that you can liaise with HMRC. They want to know that you can run Sage Payroll or some other magical payroll software. They want to know all of those things to prove that you should be considered for the role. So it can always be talked about. You don't need to have done some world-changing event or project. You just need to give people the evidence to back up why they should consider interviewing you. So that's the strong business case that I've been going on about. Those 3 sections are enough in a lot of people's cases to convince the reader that maybe they should be in the maybe pile, or the yes pile, or the pick up the phone and get them in as quickly as possible pile. That sometimes happens. Interestingly, although I've told you what Matt does, we don't yet know what Matt's career is about. We don't know he runs this business that I work for. It's not stated, obviously. There's nothing about his career history yet. For some people, they open up way too early with that information. Who you work for and what job you perform is not the most differentiating piece of information you have to offer the world, nor is the education that you have, even if you'd recently graduated. There are so many other people with that kind of information available to go to market with. What you need to focus is on, what have I got as an individual to offer you, Mr. or Mrs. Reader of my CV, that is as compelling and relevant as possible. That's the business case. That's what needs to be the focus. Okay, but, of course, there are other sections to the CV that we need to talk about, and I'll go through these very briefly. Firstly, as I've just hinted at, we do need to introduce at some stage the chronological order of things that you've been up to in your life, be that short or long. So we do need to do that. We do need to go in reverse chronological order, i.e. most recent and then work backwards. I'll show you how we do that in a minute on Matt's CV, but the basic process and structure is that if you've got a career that spans into the 90s, 80s, 70s, or even 60s, as far as the details concerned on your CV, i.e. explaining the roles and a bit about the duties and responsibilities and achievements, you only need to go back roughly 8 to 10 years. It differs for everybody. It depends where your breaks are and your roles separate. But the basic sentiment is nobody is going to interview you based on what happened in 1990-something, 1980-something, or earlier than that. It's just not going to happen. Most people are interested in what's happened in the last few minutes, seconds, weeks, months, years, to a degree. So the detail only needs to be this side of the millennium, basically. In that detail, a bit of background. Who on earth are you working for? Don't assume that people will know who you're working for. Don't assume people are going to do any research into that. They certainly won't when they're going to go from 1,500 applicants down to 5. When they get to the 5, they may take a bit more of a detailed look, but it still makes sense to explain this stuff to people. Why force them to have to do research off their own back when you could have explained briefly who is it that you work for? Are they a division of somebody else? What kind of number of employees or turnover or profits are these people making, if that can be disclosed? Just some sort of size, scale, scope indicators. You need to provide a bit about your duties and responsibilities held in each role, but not your job description. So if you're dumping your job description in your CV, that's not a good sign. You need to focus on achievements. Everybody in your peer group will have very similar duties and responsibilities. Not many in your peer group should have been able to claim the achievements that you could, or to focus the CV on deliverables as opposed to tasks that you were paid to do in the first place. So the focus needs to be very much more, what have you done with those duties and responsibilities, not the fact that you had them in the first place. For those with a career that stretches back into the 90s, 80s, 70s or earlier, just one line will suffice. I'll show you in a minute how we do that, but literally from April 95 to December 99, I was at this employer doing this role, end of, no more than that. Same rules apply to some degree in terms of qualifications, continual professional development, and your personal details. It's not differentiating information for most people. Unless you're at the real top end of your academic ability and peer group, there's no point in leading on your CV with that information. So we tend to put it towards the back of the CV. If you have specific qualifications, for example, in HR, you're CIPD qualified, you could say that in your opening summary on the statement. So when we had that experienced HR person, senior business partner, whatever, you could describe yourself as being a CIPD qualified senior HR professional, or if you're in project management, a Prince 2 qualified project manager, or if you're in finance, an ACCA or FCCA qualified finance director, finance manager, finance controller, or whatever, or just simply an MBA educated sales professional, commercial director, whatever. So you can get the headline news across in subtle ways, ways that make a difference and that do differentiate you, but the detail about where you went to university or school or the A-levels or GCSEs or O-levels that you have, nobody's remotely interested in at this stage. Ditto personal details. Where you live, the street that you're in, the number of children you have, their names, if you want to put that on your CV, bizarre, some people do, don't know why, but they do. Sometimes even national insurance numbers creep in there, inside leg measurements. I joke about that last one, of course, but that kind of detail is not going to get you an interview. So we tend to push all of that personal stuff towards the back end of the CV as well. And then another bugbear of ours is the inane words references available on request, which I guarantee 9 out of 10, if not more, people will have on their CV this evening. It's not that that's going to cause you huge problems. Nobody's going to not interview you because you put those words on your CV, but they're almost pointless. If people want references, they will ask for them whether you have them available for on request or not. They're just going to want them. Far more productive is to actually put some testimonial evidence on your CV if you have it from meaningful sources, i.e. people who've hired you, managed you, led you in some way or other. If you need to copy and paste that from LinkedIn, if you've got it, then that's fine. 1 or 2 examples would be perfectly okay, but far more productive than just putting references available on request or listing people's names and addresses of people who could be contacted, both of which are sort of virtually pointless, unless you're asked to do so, of course, which is rare. And almost as controversially, hobbies and interests. Our view is don't put them on your CV at all if they don't materially support the reason why you're applying for a job. Again, very few people are going to get an interview based on the fact that you perform certain hobbies or interests. It can actually work against you. So if you're applying for a job which could be reasonably expected to be within a vibrant, bubbly environment where you might expect an extrovert to live, so to speak, and all your hobbies and interests are perceived to be insular and introverted, it might work against you. It shouldn't, but it might. So why give people that kind of evidence? So only give evidence where it helps your business case. And a few general pointers before we look at Matt's CV finally. I won't go through all of these because time is now very tight. But there is a way of writing a CV. If you're using your name, a no-no. So don't refer to yourself by your name. Don't call yourself I this, I that. It's written in the third person, active tense. That's the way to do it. And to call yourself by a name, it just is one of those things you don't really need to do. It just doesn't look right, doesn't read right. Urban myth about number of pages. A lot of people say, oh, I must have a CV that's 2 pages. Unless you're specifically asked to submit a document on number of pages, which is very rare, there is no truth to that story that it should be X number of pages. What people hate is bad content on any number of pages, and what that's sort of evolved into is that, well, at least if we get 2 pages of nonsense, it's better than reading 3 or 4 pages, which is true, of course, but it's not going to actually make any difference to you getting an interview. So if you've got a bad CV and you've got it onto 2 pages, you're not going to get any more interviews than if you had a bad CV on 3, 4, 5, 9, 25 pages. That just doesn't stack up. It's not logical. Conversely, if you've got a really good amount of content on, say, 4 pages, you'll still get interviews. People might not read it all, but whatever they do read will be compelling and relevant. Most CVs we write are 2 or 3 pages. For anybody with a decent amount of experience, it's probably nearer the 3. Some have been 4. Nobody's ever come back to us and said, I'm not getting interviews because I've submitted a CV that's a page too long. Just doesn't stack up. The only exception being where people have specifically asked you to adhere to a particular page length, which is very rare. Right, let's briefly look at Matt's CV before we wrap up and talk a bit about LinkedIn. Flipped to the wrong page then, pressed the wrong button. First of all, very briefly, first page on Matt's CV in all its glory, so to speak. Now we can see we start the career history towards the base of page 1. That is deliberate. Most people who we write CVs for, who are permanent employees or targeting permanent work, what you see on screen is pretty much, format-wise, what it would look like. The content would differ dramatically, of course, but the flow is strong opening statement, bullet point key skills, proof through career highlights, then start the career history, bottom of page 1. It is important it's on page 1. People like to see that there. But it is also important that it's not right at the top of the CV, because as soon as people see who you're working for and what job you're doing, a picture will enter their mind. If you're lucky and it's the right picture, okay, maybe not the end of the world. But for a lot of people, they get rejected purely because somebody looks at the CV and thinks, no, our clients had people from there before, don't like them, it's not going to work. Or look at your job title, you might have a strange job title, and they'll say, no, we're not looking for people with that title, we're looking for people who are more normal, so to speak. You'll get rejected straight away. So don't open up with the stuff that can harm you. Focus on the stuff that sells your ability to deliver in a particular space that you're comfortable in delivering, that is relevant to your audience's requirements. When we do get to this area about explaining who Matt works for, which is right at the bottom of this page, he's describing very briefly, and it only needs to be briefly, who on earth is the CVIA group. Nobody will know them from Adam in most cases, so he's explaining that because he needs to make it clear. He's describing a little bit about his role, what he's broadly responsible for, and then we move on to page 2, which is appearing on your screens now. We're expanding that. He's worked for this business for a long time, so it gets a fair amount of space. It's what he's really going to be known for and measured on. So he's giving some background to who he works with, things he's responsible for, yes, but a bit more than that, stuff that couldn't easily be copied by anybody. He then is describing key achievements, projects that he's worked on, which differentiate him from most other people. Not because he's superhuman, but because what he does, if not unique, is being explained in a way that would be very hard for somebody else to copy. Whereas a CV with all the duties and responsibilities splattered all over it is dead easy to copy and just makes you look like the same as hundreds of other applicants. At the base of page 2 on Matt's CV, we see an earlier part of his life, still detailed, not much. It flows onto page 3, but not much more. Just highlighting, yeah, he worked for a big company, a PLC. He's still explaining who on earth they are, so there's no misunderstanding. He's then describing a bit about the role that he had there, but it is less relevant to the audience these days. And then finally on page 3, he's finishing off the Hayes experience that he had. His earlier career, you can see, abbreviated with 1 line per entity. Eagle-eyed of you might notice that the experience between 95 and 99, when he was at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, Matt actually pulled out one of his career highlights from Enterprise Rent-A-Car, and that features on page 1 of his CV. So if there is something that you've done in your past which really does send a good message, and you're currently trapped by mentioning that in chronological order, and so nobody ever gets to see it, career highlights are a great way of bringing forward relevant information, even if it occurred many, many years ago. So in Matt's case, he picked an example from Enterprise Rent-A-Car days because it's still highly relevant to his audience. The time doesn't matter. What he did does matter. And then in Matt's case, he's got his education, he's got his personal details, and he's got 2 pieces of testimonial evidence that you'll see, which enhance, I guess, the view that other people have of him in the eyes of his reader. Excuse me. So that wraps up Matt's CV. 3 pages, just under. A nice, strong, compelling message about what he's got to offer the world. So before we wrap up and talk about LinkedIn, which I will spend not too much time on, I promise, a brief moment of reflection. You now should have a pretty good idea as to whether your CV is going to work or not, either because you're out there in the marketplace using it, or because you can assess what I've been talking about against where you currently stand. Now, it all depends, I guess, whether you, to an extent, believe what I've been saying, I guess, but I could go blue in the face trying to convince you, so you have to make that decision yourself. But if you're not getting interviews, I can virtually guarantee it's because somebody doesn't like the message you're sending. Nothing to do with you personally, everything to do with the message you're hurling out into the marketplace. If that's the case, that can be sorted. And the way you sort it is build this business case that I have been talking about and referring to all through the session. Therefore, the only people who don't need to do anything are those happy with the level of interviews you're getting. You can define what that level of happiness is. If you're quite happy with 2 or 3 interviews out of 10 applications, that's your business. If that gets you enough to convert into offers, so be it. If you're not, then it probably points to you having to do something. And as I said earlier, 2 options really. You can fix it yourself, you can get professional help. When we've done with LinkedIn, one of the advantages of having endured this session is that you get some really good discounts on our services for those that might be thinking along those lines. And if you're in that camp, the way that works, because some people understandably think, well, how on earth can a third party write a better CV than mine? Well, hopefully I've given you some pointers as to why, because most people don't write a good CV. And there is that disconnect, remember. If 90% of individuals think they've got a strong CV and 20% of recruiters think that 20% of the candidates they get have strong CVs or less, there is a disconnect. Somebody is deluded. And to a degree, it doesn't really matter who, because ultimately the recruiters are making the decision, be they consultancies or hiring managers. We know that you can make a better fist of it. You can present a stronger argument to your audience. The way we do that is that we have a conversation with you. We extract from you in the nicest possible way all the raw data we need to be able to write a strong CV. And during that process, we assess what you're trying to do and the validity of that. And as importantly, if you don't actually know what your value proposition is, or if you find that hard to articulate, we'll do that for you. That's what, in effect, you're paying us to do. We can then also write up those career highlights and make sure we're presenting the strongest ones to your audience, because we'll know what they're looking for. So the bottom line is you leave the building with a strong business case. And we know that if you've got a good business case, whether we've done it, you've done it, or whoever, as long as it's strong and effective, it will be the engine to getting you more interviews, and potentially interviews for better jobs, however you define better. So that could be up the ladder, one rung. It could be more senior in some way, promotionally. It could be more salary, or any of those, or any combination of those, however you define it. As long as we know what your objective is, then we can assess and work out the best way of achieving that objective. So ultimately, you can do the maths, and you can work out what that might be worth, and indeed whether it's worth considering engaging a professional service to accomplish it or not, as the case may be. Okay, more on those offers later, but I promised to talk about LinkedIn, and I will talk about it briefly. But it is important. Now, my message is not you need to be on LinkedIn, and if you don't like it, tough luck. That's your call at the end of the day. It's a very important facility for people looking for opportunities or building a profile in a particular marketplace. It's not the only way of doing things, but it's one of the most effective ways of going about raising a profile and being noticed. For those that aren't aware of it, recruiters and hiring managers will use LinkedIn massively. Some spend a lot of money on it, both to post jobs but to also access the database. So if you are interested in just being more visible to recruiters and hiring managers, you really seriously ought to consider being on LinkedIn if you're not already on it. Having said that, those people that are already on it tend to have, this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but tend to have sat down one Sunday evening or afternoon with a drink thinking, I need a LinkedIn profile. Oh, this is useful. It makes it very easy. It hoovers up my CV, sticks in and fills out all the boxes that are available to be filled in, job done. Now I can get on and watch Top Gear or Downton Abbey or whatever. And that is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but that's what a lot of people tend to do when you ask them. They just thought, well, I'll set it up, leave it alone, job done. It's not as simple as that if you want an effective LinkedIn profile, unfortunately. It is different from the CV, and it's not a copy and paste job. And the trouble is, if you've got a bad CV and you just dump that into LinkedIn, you've just replicated that badness, which is not a clever idea. Our view on this is quite strong again, unsurprisingly. You need to look at the content that's going into LinkedIn, not the quality, the quantitative side, the quality of your content. On this slide it says don't worry about technical issues. What I mean by that is that LinkedIn will encourage you to fill out lots and lots of information, to fill out every box it has available in every category, and it will keep hassling you in the nicest possible way to complete that information. A lot of people do that. They get their profile scored. LinkedIn does it automatically, and it will encourage you to submit more information to increase the score of your profile. You may know that. But that doesn't mean to say you've got a good profile, unfortunately. A lot of people think, oh, you've got an all-star or an expert profile, as LinkedIn calls it. Happy days. You know, I must be God's gift to LinkedIn profile writing. And it isn't that simple. There are plenty of people out there who've got what we might call an intermediate or even a basic profile who are getting far more interest in them and their abilities than people with a higher scored profile. Why? Because it's all about the content, the quality of the content and the message you're sending, just as it is with your CV. So don't chase the data purely for the sake of it. Don't be obliged or feel obliged to fill in every single box on LinkedIn. It's not about that. It's about the message on the bits that you contribute to. And just as there are important areas on the CV, which I focused on, those 3 opening sections of the CV to build the business case, LinkedIn is a bit similar. There are 3 areas. They're slightly different areas, unhelpfully, but there are 3 areas that need to be really given some attention. The first one of those is the professional headline. It's the bit of text that appears under your name. By default, it's your job title and current place of work. You might think that's perfectly acceptable. For a lot of people, that's the first nail in the coffin, because your job title may be slightly odd. It may not be indicative of what you want to do going forwards. It may not be understood by most people in terms of what it offers. And your employer may not be a sexy employer. It may not be somebody that folk are looking to recruit from. So change it, but don't change it to available now, desperately looking, recently made redundant. They are not compelling words that recruiters like to latch onto. LinkedIn is not a place for people to necessarily find jobs. The assumption is not, if you're on LinkedIn, you must be looking for a job. LinkedIn is a professional business network. There are people on there who are not remotely interested in a job. There are other people who are desperately looking for work. But you need to position yourself as if you're just on LinkedIn, you're sort of passing the time of day, you're letting people know what you're about. If they're interested in you, the sentiment ought to be, this is me, this is what I've got to offer. If you're interested, you know what to do. Not, please call me, because I'm desperately looking for an opportunity, however desperate you might be. The summary, which is the text that appears under your header, I'll show you shortly on screen where that is for those that may not be so familiar with LinkedIn. That's important as well. It's like the opening summary on your CV. What are you? What's your value proposition? What are you good at? Aligning it with skills being sought by your marketplace. The jobs that you've done is not actually a critical area on LinkedIn. Yes, you probably need to have something, but you certainly don't need to have everything, and you certainly don't want to have lots and lots of detail. So again, dumping your CV into LinkedIn is not a clever idea. It gives away far too much. People aren't interested in that. A summary is sufficient. Just show you briefly, using Matt's profile to keep it consistent. The highlighted oval area is the professional headline just underneath Matt's name. So by default, it would be for Matt, MD or Managing Director, CVIA Group Limited. Well, big deal. What on earth does that mean? CVIA Group Limited could be an engineering company, firm of solicitors, a bank, a pension outfit. I mean, it could be anything. So Matt's message here is, in effect, he can drive success in the job market. That's what he's selling. The summary is the text highlighted now. Similar to the CV, but interestingly, you'll know, if you remember what I said about writing in the third person on the CV, LinkedIn's different. You can use the first person, I, that. It's better. It just reads better, more friendly, more approachable. So subtle differences like that need to be considered if you're going to do it properly. The third area of the 3 that are important on LinkedIn is an area that a lot of people don't use. And it's an area called projects. And if you go into your profile, those that have a profile and are familiar with it, and you click on the edit profile option, you get a screen not dissimilar to mine. I have to use mine now because I can't edit maps. And down the right-hand side, when you've clicked on Edit Profile, you'll see a box somewhere, because it depends on your profile, but somewhere saying Projects, which I've highlighted. And you click on that, and you get a screen that looks like this. And this is a brilliant place for the evidence, the career highlights that we write on our CVs that we then transport into LinkedIn. Beauty of LinkedIn is you can have lots of career highlights, lots of projects. You can call the project a name. So remember that XYZ PLC company where the person involved was transitioning 3,000 employees from 130 odd convenience outlets into XYZ's business. Let's call that, I don't know, business integration, for want of a better word, or acquisition integration. I'm not suggesting they're the greatest of words, but we could call that a name. We could link that project to that particular part of their career through the occupation, if it were listed on LinkedIn, and then we could, provide the text that we use in the career highlight in the description area on LinkedIn. Hit save, and then you've got a nice piece of evidence available. The only thing you need to be wary of course, is you can't disclose some of the information you might be happy to disclose on the CV via LinkedIn where it's visible to all. So you do need to be a bit wary about what you're talking about, otherwise some of your previous employers may get a bit uptight. So notwithstanding, it's a brilliant place to display appropriate evidence of your abilities. Finally, on LinkedIn, you can reorder all the sections, or most of them. So by default, LinkedIn comes at you with a certain flow. That flow isn't ideal. It's not the end of the world if you left it by default, but you can reorder the sections. They're drag and drop. Grab hold of a section, reposition it, makes a stronger case to your abilities than by default. Finally, I promised special offers and enticements for those that might be interested. So they're on two levels, and then we're done. I'll move on to questions and answers. So I said that if you're happy with the level of interviews you're getting, you should probably have gone by now anyway. If you're not, you can fix the problem yourself, or we might be able to help. For those that are thinking, not convinced by this guy, but I do need help, we have a DIY option where we will provide you with a template of a CV, a detailed guide on how to write the CV along the way that I've described this evening, but in more detail, of course. For the next stage in your application life, so to speak, a guide on interview coaching, particularly regarding competency-based questions and interviews. Access to a really nifty piece of kit we have, which allows you to practice interviewing in the privacy of your own home and answering questions posed at you by an avatar. All sounds very whizzy, but it's actually very good. A piece of software that we have access to, which you can play around with. When you've written your own CV, we'll then critique it for you for free and give you an honest assessment of it, and a voucher off any of our services going forward, all for a remarkably competitive $19.99 plus VAT. You need to go to that URL, which I'll copy and paste into the chat room facility in a minute when I grab it, and that will allow you to visit a web page where the deal is explained and you can see it in all its glory. And if you just bear with me, I'm just going to zap that into somewhere where you can grab the link. There you go. It should be appearing now. For those that are thinking, I am convinced by this strange man down the phone line who's gone on about CVs for as long as I can bear, but I do need help, so I'm prepared to listen for a couple more minutes, then we have a sort of done-for-you option. So we've got a DIY option, done-for-you option. This is where we rewrite your CV from scratch. We'll take care of the whole thing with the telephone conversation to extract the data from you, blah, 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 blah. We'll then rewrite your LinkedIn profile as well, so you get the two most important things sorted. You also get the coaching guide, the access to that nifty piece of kit I mentioned, and a voucher off any of our future services as part of the deal. And whereas ordinarily that lot would cost you well north of 350 quid plus VAT, we're doing it for a limited time period, 275 plus VAT. if you visit our website, you'll see the standard prices, so you know it's quite a saving off the norm. The only downside, apart from the fact that it costs money, is that that deal expires Monday midnight, next Monday. Same URL, and you can visit our website and take a look at that service. Okay, that's it. We're done. Thank you very much for your time. Apologies, it's gone on a little bit longer than planned, but I hope you got something out of that and felt it was of value. I suppose considering it's free, other than your time, probably not bad value, but hopefully it was worth listening. I promised to answer questions. There have been some. I don't know yet how many, but if you bear with me, two things are going to happen. I'm going to flick a few switches here just to stop everything from progressing. Grab a drink of water, and then return to answer questions. So I just need 30 seconds to take on some water, and then I'll be back with you, and I'll answer all the questions that have been asked. Okay, bear with me. If you need to go, by the way, obviously you're welcome to go, but if you'd like to listen to the answers to questions, you're more than welcome to hang on, even if you're just a passive participant listening to the answers. That's absolutely fine. So those that need to go, good night to you and thank you. Those that are going to stay, give me 30 seconds. I'll be back with you then.